3 sets of bloody footprints on that kitchen floor. The police report said only 2 people lived in the house. I've spent 45 years trying to account for the third. January 11th, 1979. That's where I always start when I take this folder out. Not with the bodies, not with the door, but with that date written in Vásquez's handwriting on the tab. 31 years I carried this file from office to office. Tonight, I'm going to tell you the 3 things that have never added up, and I'm going to tell you exactly why they still keep me awake. The first is the dogs. The second is the bolt on the back door. The third is a set of footprints that belonged to no one the county ever charged. I've shown these photographs to 4 different detectives across 4 different decades, and every one of them got quiet in the same way. That particular silence people go into when they see something they can't explain but don't want to admit. The Teets farm sat about 40 miles northwest of Chicago, out past where the suburbs give up trying, and the land goes flat and honest. 200 acres off Shoe Factory Road. That was the actual name of the road, which I always thought was an odd thing to name a road that led to nowhere much. Earl Sr. and Elizabeth had worked that property for 27 years. Their son Gary lived on the land with them, managed the day-to-day, and was saving to get married in the spring. There was also a small impound lot on the southeast corner where Earl ran a side operation, towed and auctioned cars, mostly county contracts. From the road, on a clear day, you could see the white farmhouse sitting at the end of a long gravel drive, bare oaks on either side, and nothing else for half a mile in any direction. Everyone I ever talked to about the Teets family said roughly the same thing, that they were the kind of people who didn't make enemies. Earl Sr. had a handshake like a carpenter's vice and would wave you down on the road just to ask how your mother was doing. Elizabeth baked. Not as a gesture, she genuinely baked, dropped things off without being asked, remembered the birthdays of neighbors' kids. Gary was the one you called when a fence was down or a truck needed pulling out of a ditch in February. He'd show up inside the hour. His fiancée Marlene told me, the first time I interviewed her, that she'd never once seen Gary turn a favor down. She said it like it was his whole personality, and she was proud of it and maybe a little tired of it, the way you talk about someone you've loved for years. Earl Sr. was not a careless man. He'd had the farm long enough to know what isolated property invites, and he'd arranged accordingly. 3 or 4 large dogs, mixed breeds, heavy-chested, the kind that don't waste energy on noise until they mean it, warning signs on every post along the drive, and then the hose. It was a thick rubber line strung across the gravel about 40 feet from the house, just below the surface of the drive. When a vehicle rolled over it, it tripped a bell mounted inside the kitchen. Earl had rigged it himself. County property tax records showed he'd filed it as a farm improvement. Vásquez told me later he'd never seen anything like it outside of a filling station. If you drove onto that property without an invitation, somebody inside that house knew within seconds. The hose alarm did not trigger the night of January 11th. That was in the first patrol officer's report, buried in a subordinate clause like it wasn't extraordinary. No activation of the drive alarm was noted. I read that line maybe 100 times over the years. It means one of 2 things. Whoever arrived that night did not come by car, or they came in before Earl set the hose at dusk, which he apparently did every evening by habit, according to Marlene. The tree line on the eastern edge of the property butted up against a county easement path that connected to a residential road about 3/4 of a mile north. On foot, in January, in the dark, through 8 inches of snow. Someone did that, or they were already inside the house when the hose went down. Neither answer is comfortable. Marlene Manke had been invited for dinner. 7 o'clock, Elizabeth's pot roast. Marlene told me she'd been looking forward to it because Elizabeth's pot roast was, in her words, the best thing she had ever put in her mouth, and she was not above admitting that. She drove out from Elgin, got there around 7:15 because she'd stopped for gas. The house was dark, not just unlit, dark in a way that felt wrong, she said, because Elizabeth always had the kitchen light on when she was expecting company, the same way some people leave a porch light. Marlene sat in the car for a moment thinking maybe she had the night wrong. She checked her watch. She did not have the night wrong. She honked. Once, then twice, then a third time with her hand flat on the horn. Nothing moved inside, No curtain, no shadow, no porch light snapping on. And then she noticed the dogs. Or rather, she noticed the absence of them. Those dogs announced every car that turned off Shoe Factory Road. Gary had joked about it to her, she told me, that you couldn't sneeze in the driveway without setting them off. Now there was nothing. Not a bark, not a whine, not the sound of nails on the porch boards. Marlene sat with the engine running and her hands on the wheel, and she told me the silence felt heavier than any sound. She waited 20 minutes in that car, talking herself into and out of going to the door. She did not go to the door. She finally drove to the nearest payphone, a quarter-mile back toward town, and called Gary's brother, Earl Jr., in Elgin. Earl Jr. was 30-some years old, worked for an equipment distributor, had a wife and 2 kids. He was not someone who panicked. Marlene told me he listened to everything she said and then was quiet for a moment, and then asked one question. Were the dogs quiet? When she said yes, he told her to go back and wait in the car, and he would be there in 45 minutes. He made it in 38. He knocked, got no answer, tried the front door, and found it latched from inside. He walked the perimeter once. When he came back around to the front, he didn't try the door again. He drove straight back to the payphone and called county police. Vásquez picked me up at the county office just before 9. I was 26 and I had been on the job 18 months, and I had processed 2 homicide scenes before that night, both of which were nothing like this. He drove without saying much, which was his way. Vásquez talked when he had something worth saying, and otherwise he just drove and chewed on his pencil and let you sit with your own thoughts. I remember the gravel under the cruiser tires sounding too loud in the dark. I remember thinking the house looked normal from a distance, and then realizing that was exactly the problem. A house where a family lived and had dinner going should have had light. The porch was dark. The drive was dark. Somewhere back in the direction of the cattle pens, a dog made one low sound and then went silent again. They broke through the back door at 9:22 p.m. I was behind Vásquez by half a step. The kitchen light was off, but our flashlights found the table right away. 2 plates set out, a third stacked beside the stove like someone had changed their mind about adding it, a pot sitting on a cold burner. The chairs were pushed back at angles that told you people had stood up fast. Earl Sr. was on the floor between the table and the hallway door. Elizabeth was near the sink. Gary was in the hallway, about 8 feet from the kitchen threshold. The house was 43 degrees. It had been cold for hours, which meant this had not just happened. I remember Vásquez putting his hand on the doorframe to steady himself just for a second, before he walked in. I had never seen him do that before. Every door in that house was accounted for. The front door was latched from the inside on a swinging bolt, the kind you slide with your thumb, no key needed, but requiring a hand from the inside to engage. The back door we'd broken through had a keyed bolt above the latch, locked from the inside when we found it, the deadbolt thrown. 2 ground floor windows had been painted shut at some point in the past decade and would have shown obvious damage if forced. The basement hatch was padlocked from outside and showed no disturbance in the snow around it. Vásquez and I walked the structure twice, independently. Neither of us found anything. It was not a house that someone had broken into or broken out of. It was a house that, by every physical measure, still had everyone inside who had started the evening there. Benny Achebe got there around 11, county coroner's office, the most careful person I ever watched work a scene. He moved slow on purpose, like he was afraid of stepping on the thing that mattered. He'd been in the kitchen maybe 12 minutes when he stopped moving entirely and crouched down near the table. He didn't call out. He just looked back at me and pointed, 2 fingers angled at the floor, and waited. I came around the table and crouched beside him, and he held his flashlight parallel to the tile, almost horizontal, so the beam raked across the surface. That's when I saw them. 3 separate patterns in the blood on the floor. 3. 2 going in directions I could account for, 1 that I could not. Benny said nothing. He didn't need to. 3 sets. That's what Benny's flashlight showed us, angled low across the tile so the tread patterns cast shadows you could actually read. Earl's large work boots. I could see the heel wear, the way a man walks who's spent 30 years on hard ground, heading toward the hallway where Gary's body was. Elizabeth's house slippers, smaller, pointing toward the back door, like she'd started to run and didn't get far. And then the third, boot-sized, deliberate. They circled the kitchen table twice. I counted the complete loops, and stopped at the back door without going through it. Whoever made those prints wasn't confused. They weren't searching. They moved like they already knew the layout of every room. I pulled Earl's documented boot size from the farm records, size 12, wide, and Gary's from his work permit application, size 10.5. The third prints measured out to a men's 10, narrow last, a work boot sole we couldn't immediately match to any brand in the house. The bolt on the back door was thrown from the inside, a thick iron sliding bolt, the kind you grab and shove home with your palm. Below it, a deadlock that required a key. That key was in Earl Sr.'s coat pocket. I held the evidence bag up to my flashlight and looked at it for a long time, trying to make the geometry work. Someone had walked to that door, and that door was locked, and the only key was on a dead man's body. There was no exit, and there were no extra prints heading anywhere else in the house. Vásquez brought up Earl Jr. first. I remember him chewing the eraser end of his pencil down to nothing while he walked through it. Earl Jr. had a reason to know the house, knew the family's routines, would have known where Earl Sr. kept his keys, but his size 13 boots eliminated him before the alibi even became relevant, and his alibi held anyway. 2 neighbors put him in Elgin until after 6, and the coroner's preliminary window on time of death was between 4 and 5:30. It wasn't him. Vásquez knew it wasn't him. We stood in that back doorway for a while without saying much, our breath making small clouds that drifted toward the dark yard, and I had the feeling that we'd just confirmed the shape of the problem without getting any closer to its answer. The obvious candidate was gone. What was left was something we didn't have a name for yet. The next morning, I walked the car lot at first light. It was that flat, gray Illinois January where the sky and the snow are the same color, and you can't tell where the horizon is. The lot sat on the east side of the property, 40, 50 impounded vehicles under snow, hood ornaments poking up, mirrors caked white. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I was trying to understand the geography of the place, how you'd move through it if you knew it. And then I saw them at the tree line. A single track of boot prints coming out of the woods on the east edge, crossing the open lot, heading toward the back of the house. They weren't mine. They weren't Vásquez's. They came from the wrong direction entirely, not from the road, not from the drive, from the trees. I crouched at the first clean print in the snow and pulled out my notepad, where I'd sketched the kitchen tread pattern the night before. Diamond pattern, center lug, narrow last. I looked at the snow print. Same diamond, same approximate width. The stride length was about 28 inches. I paced it out between 3 consecutive prints, and that matched what I'd measured on the tile. Whoever had stood in that kitchen had come through those woods. They'd bypassed the hose alarm on the drive completely, come in from the east where there was no sensor, no sign, no dog pen. They'd known exactly how to approach the house without triggering anything. That level of knowledge isn't accidental. You don't stumble through a January wood line in the dark and happen to avoid the one security measure on the property. You know it's there. I drove to the nearest neighbor that afternoon, half a mile up Shoe Factory Road, a woman named Ruth Callahan who'd lived there since before the Teets bought the farm. She had coffee on and she wanted to talk about what a shame it all was, and I let her, because people tell you the real things in the middle of the things they think you want to hear. I was about 4 minutes into it when she mentioned a young man who'd worked the car lot for the Teets the past few summers. Helped sort the impound vehicles, she said, kept the dogs company when Earl and Gary were out in the fields. Practically one of the family. That's exactly what she said. Practically one of the family. I asked his name and my pen was already moving before she finished saying it. Colt Pruett. The dogs, she said. They loved that boy. He'd get down in the pen with them, roughhouse, let them climb on him. She laughed a little when she said it, the way people do when they're describing someone they liked. Earl's dogs would take a finger off a stranger, but they'd follow Colt Pruett around like he belonged there. She said he left sometime in the fall, the way seasonal hands do, and she hadn't seen him since October. I wrote October and underlined it. I asked if she knew where he went in the off-season, if he had family nearby, a fixed address. She shook her head, said he was the kind of person who didn't seem to come from anywhere specific. I thanked her and walked back to my car and stood outside it for a moment in the cold, the bare fields running out in every direction, and I wrote his name again at the top of a clean page and drew a box around it. Back at the county records office, I pulled every file they had on seasonal agricultural workers in Cook County from 1976 onward. Fluorescent lights, the smell of old paper, a clerk who'd given up caring about anything around 1971. The Teets car lot kept informal records, a handwritten ledger, names and dates and cash amounts, no social security numbers, no formal tax reporting. I found Colt Pruett's name on 4 separate pages covering the summers of 1976, 1977, and 1978, and 1 notation for September and October of 1978. After October, nothing. No forwarding address, no W-2, no record of him in Cook County that I could locate before or after. He had worked 20 feet from that family for 3 consecutive summers, and there was almost no paper trace of him. That's not unusual for seasonal cash work, but it meant I had a name with almost nothing attached to it, and a boot print that matched, and dogs that would have wagged their tails at his arrival. 2 weeks after the murders, a woman named Pat Dolan, who ran the lunch counter at the Elgin Greyhound station, gave a statement to a county deputy. She described a man in his mid-20s, sandy-haired, quiet, who'd bought a one-way ticket south on the morning of January 25th. He'd ordered coffee and left without finishing it. She remembered him because he had a bruise under his left eye that he kept touching. I read that statement in a fluorescent hallway outside Vásquez's office, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel yet, something close to certainty. The description was general enough to fit 1,000 men, but the timeline fit, the direction fit, and the bruise. I kept coming back to the bruise because there had been a struggle in that kitchen, and whatever had happened there, someone had walked out of it, marked. Vásquez listened to me lay it out, and then he was quiet for longer than I wanted him to be. He didn't disagree with any single piece. But he pulled the witness statement and read it again himself, and he said, "Sandy-haired, mid-20s, quiet, that's half the men on a bus in January." He said the DA's office needed physical evidence or a corroborated identification, and Pat Dolan had never seen Colt Pruett before and couldn't pick him from a lineup. Without a fixed address, without a photograph, without a second witness placing Pruett specifically, there was no warrant to request. He wasn't wrong. I knew he wasn't wrong. But watching him put the file into the cardboard transfer box that afternoon felt like watching a door close on the other side of a wall I couldn't get through. The case number got a new stamp. Active suspended. It went into the backlog. Pruett kept walking. Other cases came in the way they always do. A missing child in Palatine. A fire in Berwyn with questions attached. I moved, and then I moved again, and every office I ever worked out of had the same configuration in one respect. The Teets file was in the second drawer on the left, accessible without having to look for it. I told myself I kept it close because I might need it. That wasn't entirely honest. I kept it close because putting it in storage felt like agreeing it was over, and I wasn't ready to do that. Some cases you work until they break. Some cases you just carry. The photographs never changed. Earl Sr. at the kitchen table, Elizabeth near the back door, Gary in the hallway. But the longer I looked at them over the years, the more I noticed things I'd walked past at 23 that I had no business walking past. It was the stride length that finally made me stop and measure. I'd looked at those prints hundreds of times and always focused on the tread, confirming the match, confirming the size. But somewhere in my 50s, I laid a ruler across the kitchen photographs and measured the distance between heel strikes. 26 inches. A short stride for a man in size 10 boots. The average man walking at normal pace covers 30 to 32 inches. 26 is slow, deliberate, the stride of someone who was not hurrying, not startled, not escaping. Those prints were made by a person who was completely composed inside that house after 3 people died in it, and once I understood that, everything I thought I knew about the sequence of events shifted. Because a panicked person runs. Whoever made those prints did not run. The gait was the thing that finally broke it open for me. Not the tread pattern, not the size, the stride. I measured the distance between each print, heel to toe, laid it against every person connected to that house, and one profile kept landing short. Not hurried short, not injury short. Measured. Like someone counting their steps through a room they'd walked 100 times in the dark. That kind of movement doesn't come from memory of a place, it comes from ownership of it. Whoever left those prints wasn't navigating an unfamiliar kitchen, they were moving through their own. I almost missed it. Benny Achebe's forensic notes ran to 11 pages of single-spaced typewriter, the kind of document you skim after you've already made up your mind. I read them properly for the first time in 1994, sitting at a kitchen table in Rockford, and a single line at the bottom of page 7 stopped me cold. He'd noted that the third set of prints were laid down on top of the dried blood margin, not in the wet pool, but on the edge where it had already begun to crust. The third person came in after the blood had time to settle. After. That reframing sat in my chest like something swallowed wrong. The third person may not have killed them. They may have walked into that kitchen, seen 3 bodies, understood what they were looking at, and left. Locked the door behind them with a key they weren't supposed to have. Said nothing to anyone. For 19 years, while the investigation stalled and Marlene Manke buried Gary, while Earl Jr. handled the estate, while the dogs were eventually put down, this person just lived with it. That possibility is worse to me than almost any other version of the story. The back door bolt required a key from both sides. That was the detail the original report described, but never fully interrogated. It wasn't a thumb turn, wasn't a simple slide. You needed a key to lock it from the inside as well as the outside. The key recovered from Earl Sr.'s coat pocket was the household's single documented copy, but locksmiths cut duplicates all the time for farmhands, for seasonal workers, for people who need reliable access when the family is out. You don't file that with the county. You hand it over in a driveway and forget about it. Whoever left through that door had planned, at minimum, to be able to leave. I found Colt Pruett through Arizona motor vehicle records in the spring of 1998. The database was new enough that it still felt miraculous. You typed a name, and the state answered. His record came back in under a minute. Tucson address, a '91 Ford pickup registered to his name, and a date of death notation from April 3rd of that same year. Single vehicle accident on Route 86 west of the city. No next of kin listed. I sat at that terminal for a while without moving. I'd been 2 months behind him. 2 months. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had no admissible evidence anyway, that the DA would have laughed me out. But that was the kind of thing you tell yourself so you can keep functioning. There was one line left to pull. I called the Tucson auction house that had handled Pruett's effects, a storage unit off Speedway Boulevard, contents sold in lots the previous autumn. The clerk who answered was tired and not particularly interested, but she passed me to a man named Gerald who'd done the actual inventory. He remembered the unit. He said it wasn't much. Tools, some clothing, a cardboard box of old papers and photographs that had sat unsold for 2 days before someone picked it up for $1. He described it the way people describe things they almost threw away. I wrote down everything he said, and then I asked him what was in the photographs. He paused. "A farm," he said, "and some dogs." The buyer was a retired schoolteacher in Phoenix. I tracked him down through the auction house's dollar sale log, which Gerald was kind enough to dig out. He remembered the box. He'd bought it thinking there might be something sentimental worth donating, and when he got it home and went through it, it was mostly old letters and what looked like family photographs. A white farmhouse in snow, dogs in a yard, a family standing on a porch. He'd kept it for a week, couldn't find a name or address to return it to, and put it in his recycling. He wasn't apologetic about it. Why would he be? He didn't know what he was holding. Neither did I. Until it was gone. I drove out to Shoe Factory Road on the way back to O'Hare. It wasn't rational. The flight was in 3 hours. I had nothing new, but I needed to see the property. It had sold twice since the estate closed. There was a different family's washing on the line. The long gravel drive was still there, same curve, same tree line on the east where the boot prints had come out of the woods. I sat in the car with the engine running and looked at the house for maybe 10 minutes. The guard dogs were decades dead. The hose alarm was gone. Whatever had happened inside that kitchen had left no mark on the exterior at all. The house just sat there, white and ordinary, and gave nothing back. What I have is this. Colt Pruett worked that farm for at least 2 seasons. He knew the dogs by name. The neighbor confirmed that, and the neighbor had no reason to embroider it. He had access to the house, and almost certainly to a duplicate key that was never recovered. He left Cook County within 2 weeks of the murders and never filed another Illinois tax record. He died in 1998 without next of kin, without a will, with a box of photographs of a farm that wasn't his, photographs he had kept for 20 years. None of that is a confession. None of it is enough for a warrant, living or dead. But when you lay it all in a line, it makes a shape, and the shape only points one direction. The question I can't put down is the one Benny's note made possible. The third prints came after the blood dried at the margin, but after is elastic. The blood at the pooled center was still wet when we arrived. The margin crust could have formed in 20 minutes, so the third person may have walked in with the family, been there when it happened, stepped back to the wall, waited for the blood to begin to settle, and then walked their careful circles and left. Or they arrived later and found what was already done. 20 minutes is the difference between a killer and a witness. 20 minutes is the distance between those 2 prints that I have never been able to close. I closed the folder for the last time on a Tuesday night in February, sitting exactly where I'm sitting now. Not because I'd resolved anything, I hadn't, but because I'd exhausted what the evidence could give me. 45 years is a long time to carry a question. The photographs are originals. The paper is getting fragile. Benny Achebe died in 2011. Vásquez retired to Albuquerque and passed 2 years after that. The Teets family has no surviving immediate relatives who are still asking. The farm has been other people's home for longer now than it was ever theirs. At some point, you have to acknowledge that the evidence isn't going to speak any louder than it already has. Here is what the case left me with. Not a solved puzzle, not a name on a charging document, not even the clean grief of certainty. A locked door with one key. Dogs that stayed silent because they recognized the smell of a person they trusted, and a set of prints that walked 2 careful circles around a dinner table and stopped at a door that shouldn't have opened from the inside. The prints went nowhere. That's the whole of it. Sometimes evidence doesn't lead you to the answer. It just shows you the exact shape of everything you're never going to know. And you carry that shape. You just carry it. If the dogs only stay quiet for someone they already know, who in that family's life do you think made those prints? Tell me below.